Hi guys, this is Greg Jones, and today I'm going to be bringing you a video entitled Pivot Points, a quick start to expert play. This is the first video of the ABC, SNG, Small Stakes Sit and Go Foundations videos that I'm going to be doing for Drag the Bar. My handle on Drag the Bar as well as Full Tilt and Poker Stars is 0sum79. So, the title of the video is Pivot Points, and you're probably asking yourself, what the heck is a pivot point? Alright, a pivot point is a concept that I invented. It's proprietary. You're only going to hear about it on Drag the Bar or on my blogs. And basically what a pivot point is it's a general range that works most of the time. Now, I'll be the first person to admit that that doesn't sound very exciting, but it's extremely exciting if you're trying to figure out how to beat sit and goes. Because what a pivot point does is that just by memorizing a few of these common situations where we know a good range that plays well against sort of general villains, what we're going to do is we're going to be able to go from a break-even player to a fairly highly winning player very quickly. So these are rules of thumb that basically you can use in common situations that are going to give you a very good result most of the time. And so, one thing that I've had a lot of people ask me is, are these pivot points going to basically stunt my growth? Are they going to be something that I can use at the low limits, but they don't really help me move up? They will not stunt your growth. They are based on mathematical fact from using Sit and Go Wizard to look at situations. In my opinion, pivots, for my students, pivots are the foundation for learning proper beginner and advanced sit and go play. And so, the key is that pivots are not static. Pivots are called a pivot point for a reason, and we're going to get into why that is, but basically the more advanced that you get as a player, the more you're going to be adjusting these pivot points on your own. So even though it's a sort of a static range that works most of the time, as you become more of an advanced player, what you're going to be able to do is take the pivot point and start to adjust the pivot point correctly for, a situation that doesn't quite fit what the pivot point was generated for, and you're going to find that you can become a very advanced sit and go player very rapidly. Alright. So, when we're thinking about a sit and go hand, a poker hand and no limit sit and goes, especially no limit hold'em sit and goes, since that's what I play, there's a lot of stuff to think about. Alright, the first thing is what our hand is. The second thing is, what are the effective stack sizes? Meaning, what is the stack size that we're actually risking? So, if we've got 1,000 big blinds, but everybody else at the table's got 10 big blinds, then we're only risking 10 big blinds when we play against somebody. So we think of that effective stack size in terms of what, the total number of big blinds is that we're going to be risking. And in a sit and go, we measure our stack not in chips, but in multiples of how many big blinds we have. So for example, if we have 1,000 chips and the big blind is equal to 100 chips, then we have a 10 big blind stack. Another very important thing in all forms of poker is our position at the table. And then, once you're in the tournament, there's a lot of tournament-based dynamics that you also need to worry about. Things like, are we near the bubble? What are the relative stack sizes? Is there a micro stack or a huge stack? Is there any fold equity in our play? So, for example, if we have a short stack and we're shoving into a big stack, we may worry that our fold equity is really small. Or if we've got a micro stack somewhere near us on the bubble, then we may want to be a lot more risk averse because they're about to bust out. So, when it comes down to it, there's a lot of things to think about in sit and goes, and that makes the situations that we're going to face very, very complicated. The last and most difficult concept for most beginning players is, what is our villain's hand range, and how do we adjust our hand range to respond to it? Now, this is the most challenging thing, because this is the part that beginners don't really get. First of all, they don't really understand how they themselves should be playing in all situations. And so they don't really know how to adjust for what other people are doing to try to exploit them. And it turns out that bad players do much different things than good players to try to exploit you as a winning sit and go player. So as a beginner, it's very hard to just sort of pick out of thin air what is the villain's hand range, and how am I going to adjust my hand range to compensate? Alright. Now, most people learn by trial and error. And it turns out the problem with learning by trial and error with poker in general is it's a game of incomplete information. A lot of times we don't see somebody's hand. A lot of times we don't know what they're holding and they fold. Or even if we see a showdown, we have no idea if that's representative of what they would normally do with that type of hand. And another problem with poker is that poker results are often misleading. We can't just look at a situation in a poker tournament and say to ourselves, okay, well, that worked, so that's what we should do in the future. Because a lot of times poker will mislead us into believing that something that did work is in fact the right play when it's not, based on mathematics. And based on mathematics, a lot of times we'll see things that didn't work and say to ourselves, oh man, that was terrible, I'm not going to do that again, but in fact it was the correct play. So when we're learning about poker, because of these two problems, what we need to do is we need to find a reliable source of information that basically we know is correct. And so we look for things like forums on the internet or books, or we try to find people on video coaching sites who are respected and known to be winning players and also good at communicating that winning strategy. And when you go to the forums or you go to some of these places, the problem is a lot of the people communicate information poorly. And what you run into is you run into a situation that even though they're saying the right things, as a beginner or an intermediate player, because we don't have the proper foundation built for our sit and go game, we don't really understand exactly what they're saying. We just learn what they're saying, and then we try to create a strategy, a framework for ourselves. So typically, the way that I see sit and go strategy explained is that a well-respected and good player will say something along the lines of, I believe that villain's range is X, and so I'll respond by doing the following. And we said in the previous couple slides that this is a very hard thing for a beginner to really understand. So the beginner gets some advice on the forums or gets some advice and basically says, yes, in this situation, I will do exactly what, this well-respected player is telling me to do. And then the beginning player will try to incorporate that advice into their overall strategy at the games. And the problem then becomes that beginners start to try to use that advice, but they'll even start to misapply it and use it in situations that are totally incorrect. And what happens is that beginners get sort of a mishmash of strategies. They get like, strategies that they generally think work, but they don't work in very many situations. And they start to say things that don't make sense. They start to use strategies in places where they don't make sense. They pay attention to the wrong information. And they don't know what the right information to pay attention to in the hand actually is. So they end up with this sort of mishmash, hodgepodge strategy that doesn't really work very well. It'll get them to the point where they're winning, but maybe with a very low ROI at the low stakes. And that strategy is not good enough to get them to the higher stakes. So they start to, learn about sit and goes, and typically a beginning player will get Sit and Go Wizard, because Sit and Go Wizard is actually a very nice tool. But the problem is that if you try to learn from Sit and Go Wizard by going through and looking at your hand histories, Sit and Go Wizard is actually worse than getting information from a well-respected player, because Sit and Go Wizard may actually be completely giving that player the wrong ranges and giving them incorrect advice based on incorrect ranges. So at least the, winning players, we can kind of rely on the ranges they're telling us, even if we don't know why those ranges are correct. But Sit and Go Wizard will just pull a range out of, sometimes it looks like thin air. And so it's actually very difficult to learn anything kind of lasting strategy from Sit and Go Wizard just by reviewing your hand histories from the tournaments that you've played. And so there is a strategy, actually, that I will talk about in future videos about Sit and Go Wizard and how we can try to come up with something a little bit more comprehensive. But the power of Sit and Go Wizard, in my opinion, is not really in the hand history review. Because once you're playing correctly, typically you're not making that many mistakes in Wizard. And we're going to talk about that in the Sit and Go Wizard lesson also, whereas what we can do with Sit and Go Wizard that really, really helps us to actually understand and learn Sit and Go strategy. So that's how most people explain Sit and Go hands. And now what I want to do is I basically want to go through and I want to explain how I explain a Sit and Go hand. All right. So what we do with pivot points is we redefine how we look at problems. Okay? We basically need a strategy that relies only on easily identified variables. We want to have a strategy that basically says we can look at everything that is on the table currently, and from just looking at what's on the table without having to try to deduce a villain's range, what the correct play is. So just by looking at things like position and our effective stacks and the number of blinds that we have in our stack, we want a strategy that we can use that relies on those kinds of concrete variables. And what creating a strategy like this does is it eliminates any question about what the villain's range actually is. It's not that we're ignoring the villain's range, but what happens is the villain's range starts to become built into our strategy, and we start to deduce the villain's range and the correct play without having to actually look and think, what is this guy's range? So when we do this, when we create these kinds of pivot points, what we need is a situation where the results are fairly static, meaning the results, based on the number of blinds and the position and all that sort of thing, don't really change very often. Even if the player, villain's range that we're playing against us is going to change a little bit, we want the situation to still sort of remain the same, and we want the range that we would choose to respond with to be fairly static. So, the exciting thing, which I found out, is that basically a complete strategy is actually possible, and very few pivot points are actually needed to come up with a fairly complete strategy of how to play sit and goes. So, if you're a break-even or a sort of slightly winning player, or even if you're a fairly highly winning player, but you're sort of an intuitive player and you don't know exactly, you don't feel like you have a very concrete thought process as to why you make decisions in a sit and go, then what pivot points can do is either take the break-even and losing player and get them winning extremely rapidly, which I would hope would be exciting to anybody watching the video, or it can also do something more subtle, which is it can take a player who sort of understands certain situations and it can help them speed up their decision-making process, because rather than relying on intuition, they can start to build a strategy which looks at variables and they can quickly ascertain what to do at the table. So I've had some guys who were basically winning players, but they were only playing like 3 or 4 tables at a time. And what this has been able to do is it's been able to allow them to sort of speed up how they make decisions at the table and actually rapidly increase the number of tables that they can play. Alright, so I hope I've gotten you excited for the idea of pivot points. Now what I want to do is I actually want to go through and I want to look at a couple pivot points in action and talk about, how we use them. So the first example is when we're in the big blind and somebody shoves 5 blinds into us from either the button or the small blind. And this is a typical situation. Usually when we're calling all-in shoves, we are in the big blind or in late position. And the reason why we look at the big blind is because typically we need to be a little bit tighter than this actually if we're not in the big blind, since we won't have put as much money into the pot, and also because people are left to call behind us. And so if people can call behind us, we need to be a lot tighter than this situation. So the first thing we do is we look at people who are basically trying to steal our big blind. And we assume that the player who's shoving into us is what I would term a normal bad player. All right, this is not a good winning regular. This is a player who you just randomly see at the $6.50 level or maybe $12 level or below. And we assume the bad player is on the button or the small blind.